Hello and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library that's in Michigan for you watching from home. I'm so excited to be presenting Shane Souls as our main event this afternoon, presenting on the history of professional wrestling. I first met Shane years and years ago, and it's been my dream actually to bring him to the Ann Arbor District Library all that time. So I'm really happy that he's here today. Let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, thank you everybody for coming out. All right, the history of professional wrestling, that's why we're here. So right away, let's get into it. In the beginning, before there was professional wrestling, there were showman competitions in the 1830s where the performers would invite crowd members to wrestle them and knock them down for 500 francs, which depending on your conversion is about $5,000 in current days. Which was just that. It was just traveling shows, kind of like carnivals, kind of before carnivals became carnivals, and it was, come knock me down, try. They didn't very often, obviously with that big of a prize. They were good at their jobs. They didn't lose too often. Some fun names from this time period as well. We don't have pictures because it's a little bit too early, unfortunately. But we have Edward the Steel Eater, Gustav the Bone Wrecker, and then my favorite, Bonnet of the Ox of the Low Alps. Just fun names, Post-Civil War, we get to the actual carnival days. Professional wrestling emerged in the late 1860s and 1870s as traveling performers staged matches for mass entertainment. Wrestlers, often former athletes, participated in carnivals with promoters known as carnies. Yes, that word has been around a very long time. Wrestling exhibitions involved with colorful costumes, fictional biographies, which emphasized entertainment over competitiveness. So this kind of bred the entertainment aspect of these fights versus just strict competition. It kind of evolved a bit further past that. Evolutions and changes. 3 key groups influenced the sport's nature: impresarios, carnies, and barnstormers. The impresarios managed wrestlers, creating personas for fame and interest. So they were the ones that really helped the fighters at the time kind of establish themselves as a persona, kind of give them a reason for people to want to pay attention to them, bring people out to the shows. The carnies were the ones wrestling. They devised dangerous moves like hooks, different ways to grapple onto you and very much hurt you, and engaged in high-stakes challenges. There was still a challenge aspect to this, and as far as people would challenge them to fights, and the carnies developed these very dangerous holds to really hurt you if you were starting to do too well, which led to very serious injuries, but that's what you signed up for. But of course, in any place where there's fair competition, we get the barnstormers, who cooperated with the carnies, leading to the transformation of wrestling into a business-oriented entertainment venture. So they were fixing fights. Barnstormers would pop out from the crowd and say, I can definitely take you, and they've already worked this out because anywhere that there's going to be a competition, there's going to be betting. And when there's betting, there's cheating. So that's exactly what the barnstormers were there to do, and make the most money for everybody possible on the inside. Shortly after this, we get to the early 1900s and the Farmer, Burns, and Frank Gotch era. Late 19th century saw domination by Martin Farmer Burns and his pupil Frank Gotch. Burns, a competitive wrestler, trained Gotch, who became a sports superstar. Gotch claimed the world's undisputed heavyweight championship. Burns, the teacher here, fought over 6,000 wrestlers in his time. And at the time, most of those fights were competitive. They weren't necessarily worked fights. And he was incredibly good at his job because he lost, as far as we know, less than 10 of them. Very good at taking people down. And he's the one that trained Frank Gotch, who became a national star in the early days of professional wrestling. He became world champion by beating European champion George Hackenschmidt in 1808 and 1811, or 1908 and 1911. He was immensely popular. But in that time, there were challenges in the early 20th century, including doubts about its legitimacy and a decline in popularity after Gotch's retirement in 1913. In that early time period, the early tens, the aughts and the tens, wrestling's popularity was second only to baseball. It was hugely popular. And a lot of that was due to Frank Gotch. People loved Frank Gotch. He was a very exciting wrestler in that time period. Trading cards were super popular for this time. It led to competitive wrestling programs in colleges and high schools, some of which exist still to this day, over 100 years later. So his legacy is very strong for that time period, which has just continued on. But he retired, as I said, in 1813, and after that, there just wasn't a lot of interest anymore. It faded away pretty quickly after that. But, as in everything, change comes. In an effort to attract a wide audience, a group of 3 men changed the game. We got Ed Lewis, Billy Sandow, and Toots Mott. Yes, his name is Toots. So essentially before this, everything we were talking about previously was what's known as Greco-Roman style wrestling, collegiate wrestling as you see today. And in that style of wrestling, grapples below the waist are illegal. It's just upper body grappling. What these guys did is they introduced what's called catch style wrestling, which allowed holds below the waist. So it just allowed you to do a whole lot more, create a more interesting product, and made it a better thing for everybody. These guys were known as the Goldust Trio in the 1920s. These 3 men formed the Goldust Trio, which revitalized pro wrestling in the 1920s. Introduced innovations like time-length matches, flashy holds, signature maneuvers, and popularized tag team wrestling. Time limit draws were, not time limit draws, but time limit matches was a huge innovation. Just previously when we talked about the Gotch versus Hackenschmidt World Championship match in 1908, that match lasted almost 2.5 hours. Very, very long matches, which if you're into that can be exciting, but, and again, with it being Greco-Roman, it's a lot of guys laying on the ground holding headlocks for 2.5 hours. Not the most eye-catching thing in the world. So these guys introduced flashy maneuvers, like a suplex, a body slam, interesting things that absolutely grab people's attentions, which of course became signature maneuvers. One wrestler would do a very specific move. You want to go see your favorite wrestler do that move. It's a reason to get you down there. And then popularizing tag team wrestling. We don't know exactly where tag team wrestling started, but these guys definitely, through using it so much, made it, people care about it so much more. Package shows and long-term contracts. The trio's lasting legacy was their use of a regular group of wrestlers for a packaged show. Instead of hiring wrestlers for specific dates, they kept wrestlers for extended periods of time, allowing for long-term storylines and feuds. This approach was a key factor to their success, providing regular and unique wrestling cards. So essentially before this, you would basically, as an owner of your wrestling company, grab whoever's available. Someone's around, okay, that's you and you're gonna fight. They're probably the biggest innovation in all of professional wrestling at this time was sign people to long-term contracts. You're here for months, for years, and that allowed them to establish long-term stories, long-term feuds, keep people coming back to see how this story progresses between these 2 wrestlers. So it just changed the way that you do business, essentially. Growth of wrestling promotions. During the 30s and 40s, smaller wrestling promotions engaged in intense competition, frequently poaching talent and engaging in what was termed as invasions of rival companies in a bid to attract more fans. This period also witnessed interpromotional matches happening across the country as various promotions sought to establish their dominance in the wrestling industry. So at this time, you had lots of smaller promotions around the country popping up, aping the style that the Goldust Trio was doing, using these flashier maneuvers, this newer style of wrestling. And a lot of the times the promoters would straight up go to another promotion and take their wrestlers. We'll pay you more, come work for us, and just steal them away. Some of the promoters got the wise idea to just do interpromotional matches. Bring your guy here, I'll send my guy to you, we'll trade off, and that way it just gave both of us more interest. So it was a smart way to increase business for everybody. The NWA, no, not that NWA. It was a loose confederation formed among independent wrestling companies. The NWA aimed to unify various world championships into a single world heavyweight title. Lou Thez was chosen to accomplish this task in the late 1940s and 50s. So you have a bunch of independent wrestling companies all across the country operating in their own specific little territories, usually a state or two. This is my space, this is where I operate. You're over there doing your stuff in your state. This was the idea, to bring them all under one national banner. Everybody still was able to operate mostly independently, but there was a unifying body over that. And that led to them being able to crown a national champion or a world champion that would then travel between all of the different territories, which made business in those spots very popular when the champion was coming to your town. You want to go see the world champion fight in your town, fight your guys? That's just super exciting. Lou Thez was the one that the NWA chose to be the first person to do that. So he would go around unifying championships. All of these territories had their own champions, so he would have to go and beat them to unify them to make one title. Not everybody was happy with that, though. Some of those promoters would shoot title matches. And when I say shoot, I don't mean with a camera. I mean shoot as in the fighting sense. They would send their champions out and they would fight him. Just really fight him and try to beat him to not lose. But Lou Thez was a very tough man and didn't. He was able to win them both, real matches and not matches. He was able to take over the championship, so that's why he was chosen to do that, because he was a tough guy. Here we have a map of everything across the country and into Canada, showing all of the different territories around the space. These are all the companies that got rolled up and became part of the NWA in the 1940s. Now we see the rise of television and the golden age of professional wrestling. The first pro wrestling studio television show was taped in 1942 on December 18th in Schenectady, New York. That was on WRGB, at a time when Americans owned very few television sets. About this time in 1942, there were about 5,000 television sets nationally. So not a huge business for TVs as of yet. This was very, very early in the TV days. 1947, there was the reoccurring wrestling program from Hollywood Wrestling in Los Angeles. They were the ones that were doing regular shows, which eventually became syndicated across all the states in 1952. The growth of TV in this time period is what really helped proliferate pro wrestling as a sport, as entertainment across the whole country. 5,000 TV sets in 1842. By 47, 44,000, 49, 940,000, and then by 53, 20 million TV sets. So that explosion of TV had people wanting to find something to watch, which wrestling was perfect at that. With the advent of television, wrestling matches aired locally and nationally, reaching a larger fan base. The golden age was 48 to 55, as now we look back and we call it the golden age. It was a period of enormous growth, popularity, and national expansion in professional wrestling. Wrestling aligned well with television due to its easy-to-understand nature, drama, comedy, colorful characters, and cost-effective production. At this time, it was the perfect thing. It's almost in like a weird way, like looking back on it, like they were meant for each other. TV needed something cheap and easy to understand. Well, here's professional wrestling. There's a good guy, there's a bad guy. Let's watch them fight. And it's easy to understand. You don't have to know the history. You just know it's a bad guy. You know it's a good guy. They're going to fight. You're going to watch it. You're going to have a good time. And it was cheap. Just a ring and some fighters and a camera. That's it. It's super cheap to produce, which helped everybody out as well, because you don't want to spend a lot of money at this time. You want cheap production, so that's what they got. Moderate slowdown and the NWA territory system. That's an old TV. 1950s saw a decline in ratings, By the late 1950s, after this growth period, professional wrestling experienced a decline in ratings linked to producers to reduce its presence on television. So essentially, by this time, they realized that they've just overexposed wrestling. They had it on primetime most nights, on every channel, and it just became too much. People just kind of got bored of it. It was the same thing on every channel every night, and people stopped watching it. Most stations just straight up dropped it from their programming entirely. And the ones that did keep it, it was on late nights or weekend slots, times when not a lot of people are watching anyway, and just kind of hurt the business overall. NWA was the dominant wrestling body in the 1950s, overseeing wrestling promotions, as we said. Some promoters perceived the NWA as restrictive, however, leading to the departure of several promoters who then formed their own organizations. So some of these promoters just simply didn't like the fact that you get to say who the champion is, and I want my own champion. I don't want your champion. So some people left. One of the prominent ones was Vern Gagne and the AWA. Gagne formed his own promotion within the NWA in 1957 before breaking away to establish the American Wrestling Association, the AWA. Gagne's AWA became the dominant organization in the 1960s, with Gagne himself as the top wrestler until his retirement in 1981. He put himself on top for almost 20 years, because that's what a lot of the wrestling promoters did, unfortunately, at that time. Even if you're good, I'm going to be on top, obviously. The other side, we have Bruno Sammartino and the WWF. Bruno Sammartino led the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, later renamed WWF, during the 60s and 70s. Sammartino's charisma and power moves made him the most popular American wrestler of his time. Even though it was a regional promotion somewhat through the NWA, and then once they left, he was still hugely popular. During the time period when Madison Square Garden was the WWF's primary arena, Sammartino headlined more Garden cards than any other wrestler at 211. And of those, 187 were sellouts. People loved Bruno Sammartino. He was the second champion for the WWF at the time, beating Buddy Rogers, who only held the title for 22 days. And then Bruno Sammartino held it for 2,803 days. To this day, the longest reign in history. And then eventually in 1871, he did lose to Ivan Koloff. And a funny story there, when he lost, no one thought he was going to lose, because Bruno never loses. There was a stunned silence over the crowd, and he thought that his hearing was damaged. He thought something's wrong with my ears because no one's making any noise, I can't hear anything. But it was just the crowd was silent. They just couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. It was a funny time. Impact of wrestling, wrestlers, and NWA's dominance. So, Hulk Hogan's rise to fame in the AWA brought nationwide attention, but internal disagreements led to his departure in '83, damaging the AWA's reputation. The AWA was no longer the top promotion after the WWF actually rejoined the NWA in 1971. The AWA did reach new heights after powerhouse wrestler Hulk Hogan gained nationwide attention from starring in Rocky III. People knew who he was, it got his face everywhere. And he became their top draw, which is funny because when they brought him in, he was a bad guy. But his charisma and everything was just so large, fans didn't care and they cheered him anyway. So they just ended up becoming a good guy. And he was their top draw for years, but Gagne would never let him become champion. Gagne only wanted technical wrestlers like himself or Nick Bockwinkel to be champion. Ever since its founding, he always built it off the back of technical wrestling, which Hulk Hogan was not. He was not a technical wrestler by any means. Big, showy, flashy, strong, not technical. And he left in '83, which we'll get to in a moment. Georgia Championship Wrestling was part of the NWA, achieved significant success by becoming the first nationally broadcast wrestling program on cable television in 1979 on the Turner Broadcasting Station, TBS. By 1981, GCW became the most watched show on cable television, showcasing the continued dominance of the NWA in the wrestling industry. And I do want to stress that again, the most watched show on cable television, not most watched wrestling show. The most watched show. There was nothing on cable TV that was being watched more than GCW at this time, which is crazy to think about, but it was very, very popular, even on cable. The 1980s wrestling boom. The 1980s marked a pivotal era for professional wrestling, witnessing an unprecedented surge in popularity, particularly among American youth. The World Wrestling Federation, under the leadership of Vince McMahon, played a central role in this phenomenon, revolutionizing the sport with its approach to entertainment and storytelling. So this was a time when the youth became far more involved in wrestling, as they were getting kind of marketed towards through the rise of colorful characters like Hulk Hogan. Before that, not to say it was an adult product, because it wasn't, but it was more just tough guys, which definitely appealed to a more adult audience, not necessarily little kids. Whereas this was definitely a shift towards, we want kids to come and have a good time. Hulkamania and rock and wrestling. Hulk Hogan emerged as the face of wrestling during this era, captivating audiences with his larger-than-life persona and captivating performances. The rock and wrestling connection further propelled wrestling into mainstream culture as collaborations with music icons like Cyndi Lauper brought added attention and appeal to the sport. So this was a time when they really latched on to the rise of rock and roll, MTV in the 80s, as it kind of took over TV as well. And they partnered with that, which added them mainstream appeal. Like, people were talking about wrestling on all sorts of TV shows, which hadn't happened in decades at that point. Evolution of wrestling entertainment. Television became a powerful platform for wrestling again, with events like WrestleMania attracting millions of viewers and solidifying wrestling status as a mainstream entertainment staple. Wrestling seamlessly integrated into pop culture, securing primetime slots on major networks and featuring celebrity appearances, further enhancing its widespread appeal. At this time, we were getting back into primetime wrestling, which hadn't happened since the 50s. Like, there was a huge decline in wrestling, and no one really wanted it on primetime anymore. But what the WWF was doing, the rise of Hulkamania, which just took over everything, shows like Saturday's main event was primetime wrestling, which was huge. However, this time we do see industry shifts and consolidation. The rise of the WWF signaled a shift in the wrestling landscape, leading to the decline of the NWA and the consolidation of competing promotions. Jim Crockett Promotions' efforts to challenge the WWF dominance ultimately resulted in its acquisition by Ted Turner, giving rise to World Championship Wrestling and intensifying competition within the industry. So, during this time period, as WWF is exploding, part of that was done through, shocker, not necessarily scrupulous means. They would go to other promotions, smaller promotions, which had regional television on those stations there, and would go to the television stations directly, which would, generally speaking, local promotions would, for a nominal fee, give you a tape, and the TV station would pay you. And they put your shows on. That was the way you drive business down to your local show. A couple fun matches, come see the big match this week, and then that's how they would do business. Vince McMahon through the WWF would go down and say, here's my tape. I'm going to pay you to put my tape on instead of theirs, which led to them not having any more business. No one's seeing their shows anymore because TV stations were happy to say, you want to pay me and I get to have your tape on my station? Awesome, let's go. So that just unfortunately led to a lot of them not having the support to keep going. Not long after this, the WWF does see decline as the WCW rises, kind of takes over for a while there, as the WWF style was more kiddish. A lot of very too kiddie almost to an extent. A lot of wrestlers like Doink the Clown or Duke the Dumpster Drosty, who was a garbage man. The Repo Man, guess what he did? It was a very big time in wrestling when, specifically with the WWF, where you had wrestlers with other jobs. You did a job and then you also wrestled, and that was your persona, which was fun for, like 12-year-olds. Not really for the teens, not really for the grown-ups anymore. So we saw the rise of the Attitude Era. In the mid-1990s, they were facing the competition and they wanted to shift. They wanted something new. They wanted to regain the foothold that they had. In those early 90s, WWF was doing very poorly. After the rise of Hulkamania in the 80s, it led to a big downfall. And they were honestly close to going out of business a few years if business didn't turn around. They regained their dominance by adapting to the changes, tastes of his audiences, embracing a more provocative and controversial approach. This was very characterized by violence, lots of weapons, lots of blood, edgier storylines, and sexually explicit content. It really transformed it away from that little kid product into an edgier, teen-focused product, and that's where we see the rise from there. This led to the Monday Night Wars. Monday Night Wars between WWF's Monday Night Raw and WCW's Monday Nitro intensified the rivalry between the wrestling giants. So at this time, the WWF is on USA with Monday Night Raw. WCW is on Saturdays, but they want to compete more directly. So that led to them putting their show on the exact same time on the exact same night. So you led the two giants with TV at the same time, counter-programming each other, which is just a wild thing to even consider, but that's what they wanted to do. Shortly thereafter, we get the NWO, the New World Order storyline, in which two wrestlers had left WWF, came to WCW, and saying it by not saying it seemed like they were trying to do an invasion storyline. They were still with the WWF, and we're here to beat you, which people like to see, and it led to them having a very, very successful program in those mid-90s. We also see the emergence of ECW as a third competitor. ECW, initially Eastern Championship Wrestling before becoming Extreme Championship Wrestling, including introducing a hardcore style of wrestling and attracting a dedicated fan base. When I say hardcore wrestling, I mean lots of weapons, chairs, ladders, tables, thumbtacks. But let's set that table on fire too while we're at it. Just very, very violent, crazy stuff. And they had a very dedicated fan base. Generally, they operated out of one arena in Philadelphia. And it was to the point where their weekly shows would be taped, and you would see the same fans sitting in the same seats week to week. They loved themselves some ECW. However, this came to an end of an era. So, by the late 1990s, WWF emerged victorious in the Monday Night Wars, reclaiming its status as the top promotion. WCW's decline was hastened by an aging roster and failed attempts to revitalize its product, ultimately leading to its demise in 2001. ECW, despite the passionate fan base and innovative style, faced financial difficulties and filed for bankruptcy in 2001, marking the end of an era in professional wrestling. So at this time, WCW was owned initially by Ted Turner, but through acquisitions and consolidations, it ended up being owned by AOL Time Warner. Just so many companies merging together, and through those consolidations, Ted Turner was no longer in the same power that he was initially. For the longest time, Ted Turner said, as long as I control this company, there will always be wrestling on my TV station. He didn't care if it made money. He didn't care if it lost millions of dollars a year. He just liked having wrestling on the station because of what it meant so much initially with cable. But as he lost that power, he couldn't do that anymore. And the people that were in charge of it decided, we're done. We're cutting it. We're selling it. They canceled WCW. They sold it off to Vince McMahon of WWF. He bought his competition. At the same time, ECW, in third place, tried to compete as much as they could, but they tried to do too much, too fast. They didn't have the money there where they needed to be. Their TV deals weren't panning out. And they also went bankrupt almost at the same time. It was very weird that they both failed so close together, which was also purchased by WWF and Vince McMahon. So shortly after this, there's no more national wrestling outside of WWF, so we see the rise of independent wrestling. People still love wrestling, and they want to do something different. So we get Ring of Honor in early 2002, which was very focused on technical wrestling, not flashy, not bombastic, not weapons-based, real honest-to-goodness grapple wrestling. We see Pro Wrestling Guerrilla in 2003, which is a bit more flashy, funner style, big characters. Total Nonstop Action, which for better or worse, was a lot of what WCW was, being cast off and kind of running again. And then we have Chikara as well in 2002, which featured very flashy characters, very youth-focused on just having a fun place to watch some wrestling. And that's where we have to leave it. There's no more national wrestling at this point. That's really all we have. What's this? A new challenger approaches. The groundbreaking All-In event. So, from 2001 all the way to 2018, if you want wrestling on national TV, there's nothing. There's nothing out there. There just isn't. However, the Young Bucks and Cody Rhodes organized the All-In event on September 1st in 2018. This featured talent from ROH, CMLL, a Lucha Libre promotion out of Mexico along with AAA, New Japan Pro Wrestling out of Japan, Impact Wrestling, MLW, NWA, a whole bunch of promotions all across the country coming together to do one big super show. And it was such a big event. It was the first non-WWE or WCW event to sell 10,000 tickets since 1993. Almost 25 years later, they were the first ones to be able to do it. And it was a pivotal moment, showcasing that there was power in independent wrestling. There was star power to draw outside of WWE, which a lot of people didn't know if it could exist anymore, really. It highlighted the collaborative spirit among wrestling promotions, allowing them to come together, share talent, and just do something big and fun. And it was promoted through an innovative web series, Being the Elite, on YouTube, and set the stage for future endeavors in wrestling entertainment. After this, we get the birth of AEW and industry shakeup. So, launching of All Elite Wrestling, AEW. The success of All In led to the creation of AEW by Cody Rhodes, the Young Bucks, and the Khan family. The Khan family, billionaire family, owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars and the UK Fulham soccer team. Dynamite debuts on TNT, the same station that featured WCW 20 years ago. TV wrestling got brought back to the Turner stations again 20 years later. And it was the first significant competition to WWE in decades. It was the first real change of an era, away from independent wrestling, away from a monopoly on wrestling at large, because it had significant financial backing. A billionaire willing to put a bunch of money into wrestling result in something you can actually make money off of. And they got television presence. They got on national television, on cable. They established themselves as a major player, emphasizing wrestling quality and fan engagement. So during those 20 years when WWE was on top, a lot of the time they wouldn't necessarily listen to their fan base. A wrestler would become very popular, but it wasn't one that they wanted to get popular, and would lead to them putting them down the card, making them lose a bunch of matches. It's a very soul-crushing time to be a wrestling fan. If there's a guy you like and he just keeps losing, then you just don't want to watch anymore, and it just sucks. So by being able to listen to the fan base a little bit, it made it a much more engaging product for the fans. And it also kind of blurred the line between wrestling promotions too, because we get the forbidden door that bursts wide open. It's collaboration between all of these different promotions. AEW, Impact Wrestling, New Japan, leads to fostering of interpromotional collaborations. A key moment, we see Kenny Omega from AEW winning championships on other promotions, going to a different promotion, winning their title, taking that title back onto AEW TV, something that would be unheard of until 30, 40 years ago. Like, it wouldn't happen, and now we're actually seeing it on TV. And in a weird way, we kind of see it feels like a renaissance of the territory system. You have these not regional territories of wrestling, but just smaller, distinct, independent companies sharing talent. You would have people show up kind of wherever. You never know kind of what you're going to see next. And that's kind of where we have to leave it, because if we get too much past this, we're talking about modern day, and modern day isn't history. So, and this is a history of wrestling panel, so we got to save that for later, unfortunately. One last thing I did want to mention, wrestling books. We are in a library. So you can read wrestling books. First and foremost, we have Hooker by Lou Thez. That's where a lot of the information that I got for this promotion, or for this presentation, about that real early areas in the 20s, 30s, a lot of that came from this book. So if you want to learn more about that time period, it's a great book to read. There's The Death of WCW by R.D. Reynolds and Brian Alvarez. If you want to learn about the rise of WCW, what made them take over WWF for a while before eventually crashing and burning, this is a great look into that. Sometimes on a week-by-week basis, exactly what's happening inside the company. A really fascinating look at that. Grappler is another good one. That's by a man who wrestled in the territory days in the 60s and 70s, and kind of what the inside of that looks like as a mid to higher level wrestler in that time period. And then lastly, Have a Nice Day by Mick Foley. The story of a man who wrestled in the later territory days before going international in Japan, and eventually coming back and finding stardom in WCW and in WWF. So just a few ways you can learn about wrestling right here in your local library. And that's all we have for today. Thank you, folks. All right. Yay.
Questions for Shane?
Oh, yes.
Happy to come around with the microphone. There we go.
I'm curious about what kind of relationship, if any, is there between professional wrestling as an entertainment industry and professional wrestling as a kind of legitimate sport that you see right from the Olympics down through colleges and high school? Like, do wrestlers move back between those? Do fans, do audiences, or do they keep a distance from each other as if they're kind of parallel universes that you don't talk about?
You definitely don't see a crossover. It's funny that this is called professional wrestling, but that's called amateur wrestling. I didn't make that distinction, but they do. Generally, no. You do see occasional crossover where a collegiate wrestler star will become a professional wrestler, and those have been successful on a few occasions. But you don't really go back and forth. It's just such a different thing. I consider professional wrestling a sport. I know some might, but I don't care. It's a sport. I said it. I'm up here. I can say it. But it's definitely more entertainment focused, like you are putting on a show. As far as athletics go, I think they are some of the best athletes in the world, as well as storytellers. But it's a very different thing for sure.
Is that true going all the way back into the 19th century?
In the early 1900s, yes, there was definitely some blurring of the lines at times between what was a legitimate competition and what was a show. It was very blurred, depending on who was wrestling and where they were wrestling. We talked about Lou Thez a little bit there in the 40s and 30s. He was one who did it both. If it's a real fight, I'll fight you, or are we putting on a wrestling match? And it kind of depended on what needed to happen. And depending on if people wanted to follow the script or not, too. A lot of the Goldust Trio specifically famously had a championship match that went the wrong way. They had an up-and-coming star. I can't think of his name for the life of me right now. But he was supposed to win the championship from their current champion, and the champion decided no. And then just beat him mercilessly in the ring, to the point where the ref had to just stop the match because he was afraid a riot was going to ensue if he tried to keep it going, which really hurt them in the long term after that. But, yeah. Questions?
Well, thanks so much for sharing your love of wrestling with us.
Yeah.
My question is, what 4 individuals would be on your Mount Rushmore of wrestling?
Why is it
Goldust. No. Well, Bret Hart obviously would be on there. That's a given. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels. Oh, that's a tough one. I love Stone Cold. I know he's more modern, but I don't care. It's Stone Cold. One more. Ooh, that's a tricky one. Okada. Kazuchika Okada. It's got to be Okada. He's one of the best of all time. New Japan Pro Wrestling, he was... Goddamn, he's good. Watch Okada matches all the time. They're great. So, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Steve Austin, Okada. That's my 4.
I really enjoyed the speech. I wanted to find out if you have any relationship with the guys in the southwest corner of Detroit, if you follow them at all, or...
Yeah, I've been to multiple shows for sure, but I don't have any affiliation with them. I don't know them or anything. But there's lots of good wrestling right here in Michigan.
Yeah.
If you like independent wrestling, there's some lots of good spots you can check out for sure.
So, as someone who doesn't really follow this, knows not much, can you explain why you chose those 4 Titans as yours?
Sure. The first 2, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, probably a lot of that is nostalgia because that's when I started watching wrestling, was in the late 80s, early 90s. And Bret Hart was just incredible as a technical wrestler, as a storyteller. He was a guy you believed. And I think even to this day, going back and watching that stuff from that time period, Bret Hart was one of the best of that time, for sure. He was a guy that was very believable. He worked hard. He looked like he was getting the crap beat out of him. He was really good at selling a story through a match. And then Shawn Michaels is kind of the inverse of that. He was very flashy, very showboaty. He was very larger than life. But in a more realistic sense, you had Hulk Hogan, which was a huge, jacked bodybuilder, and Shawn Michaels was more of a regular dude that was still flashy and fun. Stone Cold, Steve Austin from the Attitude Era, which I think everybody has seen an Austin 316 shirt at some point in their life, just was a badass. He was just a cool dude. He drank beers and beat the crap out of his boss. What's not to love? That's modern Americana right there. And then I chose Okada from Japan because in a modern era, really high stakes wrestling, really dangerous, the stuff that looks dangerous and can be very dangerous if done wrong, he does incredibly well. I talked about storytelling with Bret Hart. Okada carried that through like his entire career. Like he has been on top in New Japan for almost a decade at this point, and has the worst match I've saw him have, I would probably still give like a 4 out of 10 or 4 out of 5. Just like he doesn't have a bad match, no matter who he's fighting, and it's just very, very good.
Shane, I've got a question. When I was watching wrestling, the personalities often reflected national anxieties in world politics and things. Yes. So there was the Iron Sheik, there was Nikolai Volkov, and I'm wondering if that carries through to this day. Do you see that reflected over a long period of time, or was that kind of just one era?
Largely, no, we don't really see that so much anymore. In that time period, wrestling, specifically wrestling villains, were very stereotypical, very kind of one-note characters. So like the Iron Sheik was a Middle Eastern gentleman who was a bad guy, and you didn't like him because he was Middle Eastern, obviously. And that was just, it was very xenophobic, very nationalistic, and kind of the dark period of wrestling, unfortunately, which lasted a lot longer than it should have. Even like just culturally, most people were past it. Wrestling didn't get past it, which kind of sucks. So that's why it's hard to go back and watch some of that stuff too. Just seeing how xenophobic and nationalistic and sexist it is. It's kind of bad. But if you can look past that, which is hard, enjoy the athleticism at least, you can still kind of get something out of it maybe. But as we get more into modern times, like nowadays, you don't really see it as much. You still see some sexism here and there, but women are taken serious as athletes in wrestling now. It only took way too long, but at least we finally got there, I guess. Low bar to clear, but they finally did. So at least there's some benefit to nowadays. It is better. Sorry. It is better and always getting better too.
So, given your 2 favorite wrestlers, and in reference to the Montreal Screwjob, do you believe it was a work, or was it actually a screw job?
That was a shoot. That was a shoot screw job, absolutely. What they're referencing here, in the mid-90s, there was a big famous match between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. Bret Hart was the champion in WWF at the time, leaving for rival WCW, and the owner of WWF wanted him to lose to Shawn Michaels, to drop the title to him, and Bret didn't want to. Didn't want to lose to him, didn't want to drop the title to him. So they had a big match where the scripted finish was that it was going to end up in a DQ. There was going to be a run-in, just kind of a little schmaz, DQ, blah, blah, blah. He'll drop the title later. But at a very pivotal moment in the match, Shawn Michaels put on the sharpshooter, Bret Hart's signature maneuver, and the referee called for the bell, even though Bret Hart did not quit. It was a screw job. He screwed him out of the title. Vince McMahon himself was down there yelling at the ref to ring the effing bell, and he did. And it was a very crazy moment in wrestling, because we know it's not real. Like, you're not, if you go to someone and say, you know, wrestling's fake, right? Yeah, no kidding. We all know. It's just fun. You go along with it. But at that time, like, that thing was like, what is happening? I don't know. This is weird. And it was just a really, really weird thing for sure. But it was real. It happened. It was a screw job.
All right, we've got time for one last question.
So this is actually a follow-up to your answer to a prior question. I realize now in the retrospective you told, you didn't talk about women wrestlers. So could you say something about when they entered the picture, why, and what impact, if any, it's had on sort of the entertainment, the style of the entertainment, the industry as a whole, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Largely, they weren't a part of wrestling as far as the in-ring product went. They were often valets. They would accompany wrestlers to the ring. They were showpieces for sure. But as wrestlers, you would see it occasionally. It was kind of a novelty. They definitely weren't taken very seriously by many people, at least in the United States. In Japan, the Joshis, as they're called over there, were hugely popular, hugely influential into wrestling as a whole. And that's in the late 70s, mid 80s is when they started getting super popular. To the point where, if it's kind of funny to look back on those tapes now, I say tapes, videos, whatever, you know what I mean. You look back at those now, and the Joshis in Japan were doing moves there almost a decade before they got popular here. Like, they were super innovative in wrestling as a whole, and a lot of the guys here saw that and was like, I'm stealing that. That's awesome. I'm going to do that. And they took a lot of what they were doing. As far as here, women wrestling kind of started in the 80s, still didn't really get taken seriously. The 90s, again, it just kind of became a sex show. Just really hot women on TV was all they really cared about. They would make them wrestle. They weren't good at it, but they would make them wrestle. And then in the 2000s, the rise of independent wrestling saw a lot of women start getting into wrestling as actual legit competitors, and they started doing really good stuff out there. And eventually it started in WWE, where they started giving a little more time, taking a little more seriously. And then going on to modern day, they're neck and neck. Like, they're just as good as the men. Like, there's no, in some cases, better, possibly. Wrestling is really cool right now. It took a long time to get here, but man, is it cool now.
Shane, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank everyone.